At the dawn of 1940, a fresh naval aviator ensign arriving at his inaugural fleet assignment faced roughly equal odds of piloting either a biplane or monoplane fighter aircraft. This situation existed despite commercial airlines already operating passengers exclusively in contemporary all-metal low-wing monoplane designs. Meanwhile, German Messerschmitt aircraft, having demonstrated their effectiveness in Spanish conflicts, were devastating opposing forces throughout European battlefields. Among the 24 carrier-based squadrons, including 4 newest units preparing for USS Wasp's April commissioning as CV-7, this 50-50 probability persisted. Only torpedo squadrons had achieved complete monoplane conversion, operating Douglas TBD aircraft, the initial monoplanes within carrier operations, for over 2 years. Expansion and replacement programs had primarily equipped patrol squadrons with consolidated PBY monoplanes. Merely 4 of 20 patrol units continued operating older consolidated sesquiplane P2Y models. Scout observation aviators assigned to battleships or cruisers, alongside Marine second lieutenants, exclusively flew biplane aircraft. The European conflict, several months underway but temporarily quieted, had demonstrated the superiority of advanced, high-performance monoplane combat machines. Japanese military campaigns across Asia and Formosa, receiving less global attention, had similarly proven these advantages. Nevertheless, U.S. Navy aircraft inventories remained reasonably competitive with worldwide military aviation, especially compared to other naval forces. Germany's Luftwaffe, Britain's RAF, France's l'Armée de l'Air, Japanese Army and Navy aviation plus the U.S. Army Air Corps had advanced further toward re-equipping frontline units with monoplanes, though multiple factors influenced military decisions regarding biplane to monoplane transitions. Notably, Poland's now-defeated Air Force had pioneered this transition but succumbed to overwhelming numbers and superior German fighters. Early French monoplane fighters also failed to meet wartime standards. Clear evidence of aircraft modernization effectiveness emerged from Japanese Army and Navy operations in China, though this intelligence was generally minimized alongside other Japanese capabilities. Navy pilots, whether novice or veteran, who looked beyond achieving important career milestones in fleet squadron assignments, found their concerns about German and British fighter capabilities relative to current American aircraft tempered by knowledge of U.S. neutrality. New monoplanes were ordered with design specifications matching any potential adversaries, popular opinion, evident in contemporary U.S. aviation publications, held that forthcoming aircraft would exceed combat-proven designs. The temporary situation requiring torpedo bomber pilots to reduce TBD throttle settings to accommodate simulated attacks by Grumman biplane fighters would soon resolve. While most initial Brewster F-2A1 fighters had been sent to assist Finland against Russia, improved versions would replace them, followed by Grumman F-4, F-3 monoplanes. Confidence in American manufacturers was evident. Douglas DC-3 transports represented global airline standards, with companies already delivering larger, higher performance models. Reports indicated Brewster fighters helping Finland and Curtiss Hawk 75. Fighters purchased by France were effectively engaging vaunted German Messerschmitts. The Army Air Corps would soon receive Curtiss P-40 aircraft, enhanced performance and better armed advanced versions of equivalent P-36 Hawks. Moreover, events initiated in 1938 were strengthening national naval and army forces, including accelerated transitions to more effective ships and aircraft. Carrier air group objectives were clear. Scout observation types supported fleet surface operations, but longer-range Atlantic and Pacific operations remained unclear. Combat experience revealed bombing, scouting, and anti-submarine roles, though Army Air Corps mission disputes complicated matters. Regardless, the necessity for larger, faster, better-armed flying boats on order was recognized. Lighter-than-air operations were being revitalized for offshore and extended Atlantic Neutrality Patrol support. Marines anticipated receiving monoplanes to replace their air-to-ground mainstay dive bombers. Training aircraft were also addressed, recognizing that advanced models and increased quantities were planned. Initial low-wing monoplane trainers were operational all-land planes, first fixed, gear North American NJ-1 aircraft, followed by retractable gear SNJ-1 derivatives. These would introduce new fleet aircraft flight characteristics into pilot training, which traditional obsolete fleet types couldn't accomplish. Insufficient numbers remained to support ongoing training expansion. Despite domestic peace, uneasiness prevailed. European war and Sino-Japanese conflict were undeniably real. Spring ended European lull. Germany occupied Denmark and invaded Norway, prompting Britain's first carrier action, though their fighters proved inadequate against German Messerschmitts. President Roosevelt announced his 50,000 airplane program in April, coinciding with WASP's commissioning as the sixth active fleet carrier. May witnessed Germany unleashing Luftwaffe and Panzer divisions against Low Countries and France, circumventing France's impregnable Maginot Line in another blitzkrieg assault, with U.S. sympathies clearly favoring Britain and France. Part. The 50,000 airplane program included quantities for their support. National neutrality bent maximally toward assisting them. Additional military sales occurred with priority deliveries, including 50 biplane Curtiss SBC-4 dive bombers withdrawn from Navy reserves for France. Late May and early June saw British forces evacuation, plus many French soldiers, from Dunkirk across the Channel under the war's most intense air combat. June brought France's fall. Armistice terms allowed German occupation of much territory, particularly Channel coastal areas, with obvious English intentions. Italy, meanwhile, joined Germany. Against this backdrop, Congress acted to further increase armed forces in keeping with the presidential 50,000 plane program. Naval Aviation would expand to 10,000 aircraft with accompanying carriers and auxiliaries. Considering training time requirements for pilots, aircraft, and carriers, major orders were placed for hundreds of training planes, significant increases for current production combat models, and production of advanced models. The first 3 new class carriers were also ordered. July brought German invasion plans for England, recognizing RAF fighter elimination as the initial requirement. This action, later known as the Battle of Britain, commenced in August. Only those requiring knowledge understood this battle's outcome would depend on new radio direction finding systems and supporting fighter direction centers established by the RAF. The Navy, led by Naval Research Laboratory, had pursued identical radio technology secretly. Following experimental fleet trials, action proceeded on the first carrier installation aboard Yorktown CV-5. The British Tizard Commission visited the US, facilitating high-level exchanges resulting in major technological advances for both nations, with immediate applications to what would officially become radar. While battles raged over England and the Channel, first deliveries of new monoplanes directly interested marine aviation personnel and battleship, cruiser seaplane operators. These were Douglas SBD-1 dive bombers and Vought Sikorsky OS-2U-1 aircraft, respectively. OS-2U aircraft, like predecessors, operated as seaplanes or landplanes. Neither featured folding wings characterizing almost all subsequent shipboard aircraft, and .30 caliber guns comprised major armament components, but otherwise typified construction and basic features of future designs. That month, numerous older destroyers converted as seaplane tenders supporting wider-ranging PBY-VP squadrons in both oceans. Hitler cancelled German invasion plans mid-September. RAF pilots in Hurricanes and Spitfires, guided by radar-based fighter directors, had stopped Luftwaffe's elimination drive. Casualties were heavy on both sides with slim margins, but the few had won. The Luftwaffe remained far from defeated, however, and London's Blitz, night bombing, began. The war expanded as Italians, already fighting in North Africa, moved through Balkans and invaded Greece. Initial Martin PBM-1 aircraft, the first fleet aircraft with power turrets, entered VP-55 service. This began a new generation of larger Navy flying boats promising increased performance, armament, and payload over PBY aircraft. Armor protection for patrol plane crews was also introduced. Yorktown deployed with new radar. Through destroyer-for-bases trade, VP Neutrality Patrol operations extended from Bermuda to Newfoundland, while the first new seaplane tender supporting VP operations where bases weren't available, Curtiss AV-4, was commissioned in November. Deliveries of the first 200 improved PBY-5 aircraft ordered in December 1939 promised better VP squadron capabilities, and the first PB-2Y delivered in December brought new capabilities. For carrier squadrons, initial SBD-2 aircraft with greater range than -1 models and first F-4, F-3 aircraft were finally arriving. The first directive replaced bright aircraft colors and markings with low-visibility paint, light gray overall, except blue, gray on patrol plane upper surfaces. As 1941 developed, European and African warfare continued escalating. Germany supported Italians in northern Africa, again pushing British forces toward Egypt. Small and significant victories and new offensives occurred on each side. Across the Pacific, tensions increased as Sino-Japanese War expanded. Gradual increases in newer model aircraft in Navy fleet squadrons continued. After 5 months at sea with new radar, Yorktown's commanding officer reported effectiveness and recommended carrier radar equipment, along with special tracking and plotting facilities, and friendly aircraft electronic identification devices. By summer, Britain and allies lost in Greece and Crete while securing the Middle East. In the Atlantic, German submarine warfare against shipping created the latest threat to British survival. Lend-Lease, initiated in March to provide greater assistance to those whose defense was important to US defense, made more military aircraft directly available, primarily to British forces. June brought one of the war's great surprises as Germany turned on Poland's former partner and invaded Russia. July saw initial payoff from previous year's Tizard Commission meetings as first PBY and PBM aircraft of Patrol Wing 7 received British radar systems. Awkward in operation and installation, with long, separate transmitting and receiving antennas at low operating frequency, the former on insulated stub supports along forward hulls, they introduced both aircrew and ground personnel to entirely new Navy airborne operational capabilities. With increased anti-submarine warfare operations, including RAF Coastal Command and radar usage, shipping losses to German submarines and aircraft in Britain's blockade were greatly reduced. But submarines began hunting more broadly. Recognizing northern Atlantic wintertime flying boat operational difficulties, and with airfields available from destroyer-for-bases trade, the Navy acquired 20 Lockheed Hudsons from British Lend-Lease allotments in October as PB-01 aircraft equipping VP-82. The next month brought the first PBY-5A amphibian version of what was now the Catalina to the fleet. Another large carrier, Hornet, and the first escort carrier Long Island CVE-1 converted from a merchant ship were commissioned that fall. On the diplomatic front, Japanese-US relations deteriorated and were reaching standoff climax. By late November 1941, the Navy counted approximately 1,500 first-line combat planes in a total inventory exceeding 2,150 aircraft. The remainder comprised trainers and support aircraft, reserve units, and various special assignment and obsolete aircraft. The 1,500 filled 9 fighter, 14 scout, dive bomber, and 5 torpedo plane squadrons in air groups for 7 carriers, 4 each marine fighter and dive bomber and 1 marine observation squadron, 23 patrol, and 1 scouting squadron for the new escort carrier. Also included were over 500 scout, observation seaplanes for battleship and cruiser operations, with more than half actually used in seaplane training. The few scout, bomber biplanes remaining among carrier squadrons were part of working up planes assigned to new Hornet Air Group. Marine ones were still flown by the observation squadron. All fighters carried 4 forward-firing .50 caliber guns, F-4F aircraft having 2 in each wing, while F-2A aircraft still carried 2 under the cowling, synchronized to fire between propeller blades, as did SBD aircraft. While armor and self-sealing tanks were being installed in new production-delivered carrier types, they were only beginning backfitting into squadron-assigned aircraft. External wing carriage was limited to 1 100-pound bomb on each side, while dive bombers could carry up to 1 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage and TBD aircraft 1 Mk-13 torpedo. Catalinas comprised almost all VP inventory, VP-55 with PBM-1 Mariners, VP-13 with PB-2Y2 Coronados, and recently formed land-based VP-82 with PB-01 Hudsons being exceptions. First PBY-5A amphibians were entering service with San Diego-based Transition Training Squadron. Both .50 caliber and .30 caliber guns were fired by flying boat gunners, all manually trained except .50 caliber guns in PBM and PB-2Y power turrets. Maximum bomb loads varied from up to 4 1,000-pound bombs on PBY aircraft to 6 on PBM aircraft and 12 on PB-2Y aircraft. Alternatively, 2 torpedoes could be carried on any patrol planes. While our Navy's strength was distributed across 2 oceans, primary carrier combat concern focused on the Pacific, regarding Japan. Their carrier fleet composition was known, but air group inventory remained questionable. It proved formidable, particularly since all was available for Pacific operations. Japanese carrier forces operated in carrier divisions, basically each division having paired carriers and aircraft complements. 3 main carrier divisions, each with 2 large carriers, were equipped with latest aircraft. Each carrier's complement included 18 fighters and 18 or 27 each torpedo bombers and dive bombers. Fighters were Mitsubishi A-6M-2 Type Zeros of later renown, torpedo bombers Nakajima B-6N-2 aircraft, which proved considerably more capable than our TBD aircraft, and dive bombers HED-3, A-1 aircraft whose fixed landing gears contrasted with otherwise clean lines of all these Japanese carrier aircraft. While D-3A-1 aircraft, later code-named VAL, were inferior to Dauntless aircraft, Zeros, like B-6N-2 aircraft, later Kate, would demonstrate combat performance superior to USN contemporary Wildcats. Some superiority resulted from lighter construction, lacking armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, but it was also aerodynamically and structurally a most efficient and effective design. 2 other carrier divisions operated 3 light carriers total, each with 1 smaller squadron of fighters and 1 of torpedo bombers, mostly older models then. Having numerous island bases, considerable numbers of land-based bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and fighters were operated from these, plus limited long-range flying boats. Along with these long-range monoplane seaplanes, numerous single-engined short-range biplanes were also operated from bases, as well as from various ships, and a few small 2-place monoplanes from submarines, with special watertight hangars. On December 7, 1941, aircraft from 6 carriers of the Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet attacked Navy and Army bases in Hawaii. Ready or not, naval aviation entered World War II. Fortunately, our carriers were at sea. Significantly, with minimum additions and having lost 1 carrier in the Battle of Coral Sea, the carriers and aircraft of the U.S. fleet were substantially the same when they delivered the Japanese their most important and worst defeat of the war at Midway 6 months later. The Atlantic Neutrality Patrol operations, 1939 to 1941. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the long-dreaded and expected World War II commenced. Britain and France's war declarations against Germany 2 days afterward demonstrated that the conflict would inevitably encompass all of Europe, echoing the 1914 beginning of World War I. The Allies would once more depend upon United States support for supplies and munitions, deliverable only via ships traversing the Atlantic. Germany would certainly attempt to halt such commerce through U-boat and surface radar attacks, making the Atlantic once again, as in World War I, a primary battlefield. It was predetermined that Atlantic warfare would jeopardize United States neutrality, prompting the Navy to act swiftly in minimizing this threat. The day European war began, the Chief of Naval Operations informed U.S. forces that German U-boats were prepared to commence Atlantic shipping lane operations, with reports indicating a dozen German merchant vessels were being armed as raiders. The advisory noted that neutral merchantmen, including U.S.-flagged ships, could anticipate similar British actions, and that the U.S., as a neutral nation, had the duty to prevent such activities within territorial waters and ensure no interference with high seas rights. The 1935 Neutrality Act, made more restrictive by 1937 amendments, prohibited arms exports, either direct or through transshipment, to any belligerent and was viewed by isolationist groups as optimal insurance against U.S. involvement in European warfare. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued his initial neutrality proclamation on September 5, 1939, declaring partly that any use of U.S. territorial waters for hostile operations would be considered unfriendly, offensive, and a violation of U.S. neutrality. The Navy had initiated action September 4th through CNO dispatch to Commander, Atlantic Squadron, directing establishment of air and ship patrols to observe and report through classified means movement of belligerent warships within designated areas. The patrol would encompass an area bounded northward by a line east from Boston to latitude 42 degrees 30 minutes, longitude 65 degrees, south to latitude 19 degrees, then around the Windward and Leeward Islands to Trinidad. The following day, CNO expanded his directive by ordering classified contact reports on foreign warships approaching or departing the U.S. East Coast or the Eastern Caribbean boundary. Ships observed by patrols, both aerial and surface, were to be identified by name, nationality, estimated tonnage, color, and markings, and photographed when possible. Course and speed were to be estimated and all information recorded and reported upon base return. On September 6th, Commander, Atlantic Squadron reported to CNO that the patrol was operational, and by the 20th, when revised Atlantic Squadron Op. Order 2039 became effective, Atlantic coastal waters from Nova Scotia, Canada, to the Lesser Antilles, West Indies, were under daily surveillance by surface and air patrols. Forces involved were primarily patrol aircraft from Patrol Squadron, VP, 51, 12 PBY-1 aircraft, VP 52, 6 P2Y2 aircraft, VP 53, 12 P2Y aircraft, and VP 54, 12 PBY2 aircraft of Patrol Wing, Pat Wing, 5 and VP 33, 12 PBY3 aircraft of Pat Wing 3, plus 4 seaplane tenders assigned to the Pat Wings. Surface forces were battleships and cruisers of the Atlantic Squadron and their attached OS-2, U and SOC aircraft of Observation Squadron, VO, 5, and Cruiser Scouting Squadron, VCS, 7, Ranger CV-4 with her air group, and Wasp CV-7, which was not yet commissioned. 40 destroyers plus an undetermined number of old destroyers, to be recommissioned, and approximately 15 old submarines comprised the assigned surface forces. Aircraft patrols were initiated by patrol squadrons, deployed to assigned neutrality patrol bases, most poorly equipped to support aircraft and crews for flight operations at the level required for daily patrols. General orders to patrols emphasized operational safety, avoidance of non-neutral acts, and exercising care in approaching vessels to avoid actions that might be interpreted as hostile. VP 51 deployed PBY-1 aircraft to San Juan, PR, departing Norfolk, Virginia, on September 12th, with initial patrols flown on the 13th. The squadron utilized seaplane facilities, including ramp and hangar, of Pan American Airways at San Juan Airport, housing crew, and supporting activities in tents on the airport. The site utilized was the area where future Naval Air Station, NAS, San Juan, would be constructed, beginning in 1940. VP 50, one's patrols covered harbors and shipping lanes in the West Indies from Puerto Rico to Trinidad, with special attention to southern Caribbean approaches through the Lesser Antilles. VPs 52 and 53. Both continued flying P2Y aircraft from home port Norfolk, patrolling mid-Atlantic coastal shipping lanes, coordinating operations with Atlantic Squadron destroyers. VP 53 had returned to Norfolk September 1st after regular summer deployment to Annapolis, Maryland, for midshipman aviation training. VP 54, based at Norfolk, deployed a detachment of PBY-2 aircraft to Newport, Rhode Island, operating from the Naval Torpedo Factory Air Facility on Gould Island in Narragansett Bay. RI daily searches were coordinated with destroyer surface patrols in assigned offshore areas. VP 33 deployed PBY-3 aircraft from Coco Solo, Canal Zone, to Guantanamo, Cuba. Patrols covered the area from Guantanamo to San Juan, coordinated with VP 51 destroyers and the cruisers Tuscaloosa CA-37 and San Francisco CA-38. Cruisers Quincy CA-39 and Vincennes CA-44 patrolled sea approaches between Norfolk and Newport. Battleship Division 5 and Ranger were based at Norfolk as a reserve force. Experience during the initial month of operations dictated changes in force deployment to improve assigned area coverage. VP-52 moved to the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station located on Cooper River in Charleston, South Carolina, Navy Yard in December. Renovation and modification of existing buildings provided facilities to house crew and squadron administrative and maintenance activities. The air station supplied a seaplane ramp, aircraft parking area, and shared space in a small hangar. Officers were quartered in the Coast Guard BOQ. Moving the squadron proved a major exercise itself. VP-52 had been home-ported at NAS Norfolk since first commissioned as VP-14 on November 1, 1935, when the station was NAS Hampton Roads. As a self-supported squadron, a full allowance of maintenance equipment, spares, records, and myriad other authorized and unauthorized odds and ends accumulated required packing and loading aboard railroad cars for the southward move. The operation was further complicated by a full schedule of training flights, in addition to daily patrols of assigned offshore areas. VP-33's initial move to Guantanamo posed problems similar to those of VP-52, somewhat diminished by in-place facilities of the fully operational naval station there. However, the October move of VP-33 detachment to Naval Station, Key West, FLA, long out of service and mothballed, demanded considerable effort by plane crews and their support personnel. Key West businesses and the population generally were so pleased by PBY arrival and several submarines that a celebration, including a parade on the main street, was staged. A VP-33 contingent participated in the event. The Key West detachment flew regular patrols from Dry Tortugas to Miami, FLA, and to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, covering the Florida Straits and Yucatan Channel. In November 1939, VP-53 exchanged P-2Y aircraft for a mixed assortment of older model PBY aircraft, 3 PBY-1 aircraft, 3 PBY-2 aircraft, and 3 PBY-3 aircraft. In February 1940, the squadron moved to Key West, remaining there until April 1941 when it returned to Norfolk, and exchanged the old PBY aircraft for new PBY-5 aircraft. Also in October of that year, Ranger and her air group had joined Cruiser Division's 7 ships and their VCS-7 SOC aircraft to form a strike group with long-range search capability on standby to fill gaps in areas covered by regular patrols. In November, a surface patrol of destroyers was established in the Gulf of Mexico to track shipping in that area. The Navy patrol effort was expanded by Coast Guard surface and aircraft coverage of inshore areas and cooperation through information exchange, ensuring complete area coverage and recording of all contacts. On October 16th, Commander Atlantic Squadron expanded his earlier orders to patrol forces with the issuance of OP Order 24-39. In addition to reporting foreign warships, suspicious vessels were to be noted, and both they and warships were to be tracked until their actions were considered satisfactory. All Atlantic Squadron units were included in the task organization, but the major portion of patrol activity was conducted by patrol squadrons and destroyers, the latter primarily responsible for developing, visually checking at close range, contacts made by aircraft. Employment of battleships was minimized, and Crew Div 7 ships were soon withdrawn from patrol for other duties. The scope of neutrality patrol operations gradually expanded during 1940. Concurrently, aircrews normally required training in all aspects of patrol plane operations, tactics, instruments, navigation, gunnery, bombing, etc. For example, VP-52 deployed detachments from Charleston to advanced bases such as Paris Island and Winya Bay, both in SC, for operations with aircraft tenders, Owl AM-2 in August and Thrush AVP-3 in October. In addition to regular patrols, a normal schedule of training flights was flown from advanced bases. Despite increasing operational tempo and resulting workload, the effort proved well worth its costs. The experience markedly enhanced neutrality patrol squadron readiness for tasks that lay a scant year ahead in World War II. The European War during 1940 saw apparently invincible German forces defeat France and threatened to bring Britain to her knees by the blitz on her cities and U-boat success in the Atlantic. The spectre of British defeat and danger to the United States of such an event were obvious and dictated further expansion of Atlantic forces. In the famous Destroyers for Bases agreement negotiated by President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in September 1940, sites for bases in the Atlantic and Caribbean were exchanged for 50 World War I destroyers. 2 sites, Argentia, Newfoundland and Bermuda, presented rent-free as a gift for 99 years, would become key elements in the Battle of the Atlantic. 6 other sites, in the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Antigua and British Guyana, were leased rent-free for the same period. Both air and surface elements of the patrol force expanded during 1940 as the operations scope grew. Pat Wing 5 at Norfolk commissioned VP-55 on August 1st and VP-56 on October 1st. Both were to be equipped with PBM-1 aircraft, but problems with new planes delayed deliveries and severely restricted squadron training. Eventually, the squadrons would be merged into a single command, designated VP-74, with all early production PBM aircraft assigned. On November 1, 1940, the Atlantic Squadron was redesignated Patrol Force, Atlantic Fleet, and on December 17, then Rear Admiral Ernest J. King relieved Rear Admiral Hayne Ellis as Commander, Patrol Force. On February 1, 1941, the augmented and reorganized patrol forces were established under Admiral King as the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. This force reorganization included establishment of task forces responsible for operations in specific Atlantic sectors. Task Force 1, composed of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, covered trade routes to northern Europe. Task Force 2, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, patrolled the central North Atlantic. Task Force 3, cruisers, destroyers, and minecraft, was based at San Juan and Guantanamo to cover the South Atlantic. Task Force 4 was Support Force, Atlantic Fleet, under Rear Admiral A. L. Bristol, established on March 1, 1941. The support force included destroyers and the patrol wing, with VPs 51, 52, 55, and 56, and tenders Albemarle AV-5 and George E. Badger AVD-3 attached. On April 5, VP-53 rejoined the wing at Norfolk, and during the month exchanged its old model PBY aircraft for new PBY-5 aircraft. The establishing directive for the support force required preparation for high-latitude service and emphasized training in anti-submarine warfare, shipping protection, and defense against air, submarine, and surface radar attack. Primary mission of the force was operations from North Atlantic bases to prevent Axis forces from interfering with war material shipment from the United States to Great Britain. Other air and surface forces originally operating with the Neutrality Patrol were subsequently designated Task Force 6, and elements based north of the Gulf and Caribbean became the Northern Patrol. The Northern Patrol mission, operating from bases at Norfolk, Bermuda, Narragansett Bay, and Argentia, would be to investigate reports of potential enemy vessels and other non-American activity in the North Atlantic. This task gave the Patwing Support Force major responsibility for naval aviation's advance to the north and east to ensure safe passage of war materials to Britain. Prior to Patwing Support Force establishment, several squadron redeployments were directed. VP-54 moved to Bermuda, based on tender George E. Badger, and began neutrality patrol operations on November 15, 1940. In December, VP-52 exchanged its P-2Y2 aircraft, last of the model in fleet service, for PBY-5 aircraft. The P-2Y aircraft were ferried from Charleston to Pensacola for training squadron use there. Replacement PBY-5 aircraft were ferried cross-country from San Diego by VP-14 and delivered to VP-52 at Pensacola during January. VP-52 flew the new planes, as received, to its old home port, NAS Norfolk. The Charleston move was essential as facilities there could not support PBY operations. On February 1, 1941, VP-52 was transferred to San Juan for what proved to be a brief taste of tropical operations. The squadron joined VP-51 on still unfinished NAS San Juan, sharing neutrality patrols through the West Indies to Trinidad. In addition to patrols, there were mail runs and survey flights to island sites of new stations being built under the Destroyers for Bases agreement. At February's end, VP-52 was ordered back to Norfolk, and on March 3 all planes departed for the return. For the remainder of the month, the the squadron flew patrols and convoy escort and continued intensive crew training at Norfolk. On April 8, 1941, VP-51 moved to NAS New York, Floyd Bennett Field. Neutrality Patrol activity was expanding, with convoy escort and ASW search in northern offshore shipping lanes an increasing proportion of aircraft effort. During April, VP-52 moved again to NAS Quonset Point, Rhode Island, another new naval air station under construction. Although this was to be home port, preparations began immediately for squadron deployment to Argentia, Newfoundland, to be based on Patwing Support Force flagship, Albemarle. On May 24, VP-53 was ordered to move from Norfolk to Quonset Point. Construction of the base at Argentia, and other destroyers for base's site, had not yet begun. VP-52's deployment would be the first move toward implementing the Northern Patrol Support Force mission. The major North Atlantic shipping lanes would now be within PBY range for convoy escort. Albemarle arrived at Argentia on May 15, with VP-52's ground crew and squadron gear on board. Preparations for aircraft operations began with a seaplane mooring area designated and buoys laid in Placentia Harbor's southwestern end near the ship anchorage. This operating area was adjacent to the peninsula where NAS Argentia would eventually be built. After an attempt on May 18th, aborted because of below minimums weather in Argentia, all 12 VP-52 planes arrived on May 20th. The weather was again marginal, but, utilizing Albemarle's radio beacon, all aircraft made instrument approaches and safe landings. The next day, weather was excellent and all crews were scheduled for and flew area familiarization flights. This proved most fortunate because weather was below minimums on the following 2 days and, on the 24th, the squadron was ordered to fly a major operation, one of the least-known events in pre-WW2 Naval Aviation history. The German battleship Bismarck, on her first operational sortie, had been engaged by a British force in Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland early on May 24, 1941. HMS Hood was sunk by Bismarck, which then, in company with her escort cruiser Prince Eugen, eluded the British force and disappeared. The search effort launched to locate the German ships included VP-52's PBY aircraft in what was certainly a broad interpretation of the Neutrality Patrol. Of the 11 planes at Argentia, Newfoundland 4, 52 P5-9-10-11 were scheduled for a search of western Greenland on the 24th for signs of German occupation. That flight was delayed by weather, but at about 13:30 hours, crews standing by in the planes were ordered by blinker light signal from the ship to prepare for immediate takeoff. By 14:30 hours, pilots arrived at the planes, and after a hurried crew briefing with no details of the highly classified mission, engines were started and the planes took off at about 14:40 hours. They were to proceed to an area south of Cape Farewell, Greenland, to search for a ship. Planes were unarmed with instructions to maintain contact if a sighting was made, and to send contact reports in plain language on the International Emergency CW frequency, 500 kc. After join-up, the 4 PBY aircraft climbed on top of the cloud deck, proceeded to the assigned area, and let down to about 700 feet for the search. Visibility was limited, but a scouting line was formed, then standard procedure, and search of the area in rapidly dwindling daylight began. When darkness and limited visibility made further effort fruitless, the flight leader ordered an individual return to base. During the climb, icing and turbulence were encountered, but all planes found clear areas between layers and proceeded toward Argentia. As the planes continued on course, cloud tops built up, and eventually the PBY aircraft were at 20,000 feet to stay clear of clouds to avoid icing. The extreme cold and lack of oxygen contributed to navigation problems, resulting from numerous course changes to avoid build-ups, and, at dawn, as planes approached Argentia, only one flyer, legendary Navy P-boat pilot Chief Boatswain Pat Byrne, was sure of his position. Radio contacts with Albemarle AV-5 brought word of worsening weather and orders to proceed southwest to find an alternate landing site, if fuel levels permitted, or to hold over the ship and make an instrument approach when weather improved. Of the planes in the first group, only 52 P-5, flown by Byrne, made an instrument letdown and landed outside Argentia Harbour in Placentia Bay. With favourable 40-plus knot wind, Pat cut the engines and sailed the PBY into the harbour. Of the other 3 planes about 15 miles from Albemarle, Number 9, flown by Ensign Dexter Rumsey and the writer, found a hole and let down for a safe landing at Jamestown on Trinity Bay on Newfoundland's east side. When weather at Argentia improved, Number 9 was able to get in, with a total of some 22 hours in the air and fewer than 100 gallons of fuel remaining. Number 10 heeded the ship's radioed advice and headed southwest, breaking into clear weather over Nova Scotia and continuing for a landing at Newport, Rhode Island, with about 20 hours flight time logged. The last plane of the first group, 52 P-11, was trapped above the overcast with fuel nearly exhausted, and the crew preparing to bail out when a hole in the clouds suddenly appeared. After a tight spiral letdown into a narrow valley, which led them to the sea and Forto Bay, Labrador, a safe landing was made after some 20 hours in the air. The crew anchored off a beach near a cluster of houses, and after confirming their location by talking to men who rowed out to the plane, contacted Albemarle for instructions. Advised to remain where they were for the night, they were assured fuel would be flown in as soon as possible. Unfortunately, winds increased during the night and changed direction, forcing the crew to seek better holding ground for the anchor and shelter from ice floes being driven by the wind. During the move, Naval Aviation pilot Bob Webber, who was handling the anchor, was swept off the bow by a wave which broke over the PBY. Ice floes driven by the wind had cracked the bomber's window and punctured the hull below the waterline, resulting in leaks which flooded the bow compartment to the floorboards. The loss of buoyancy resulted in seas breaking continuously over the bow and the plane taking on more water. The plane commander then decided to beach the PBY to avoid further damage and to seek help for a search for Webber. A sand beach about half a mile away was selected as the best site available, and the plane was beached there with no additional damage. Local fishermen, alerted by the sound of engines, had seen Weber swept off the bow and launched a boat to search for him. Continuing the string of near miracles, the 2 men rowing the boat found semi-conscious Webber and rowed back to the beach, towing him with his arms over the stern of the boat, one of the rescuers holding onto them to keep Webber's head above the water. Uninjured, though his fleece-lined flight suit had been slashed by a propeller as he was swept under the wing, Webber was taken to a house and after being stripped and rubbed down was put to bed. Later in the day he was moved to a mission clinic in the settlement and remained there under the care of a resident nurse until he was returned to Albemarle by plane. With local people's help, the plane crew rigged a block and tackle to haul Number 11 clear of the breakers, to prevent further damage and to make damaged areas accessible. The crew turned to with materials and tools aboard the plane and prepared the hole in the hull and the cracked bomber's window for repair. Later that day, May 26th, a PBY arrived from Argentia with a repair party and fuel. After completing repairs, sand was dug from beneath Number 11 and it was refloated with the help, again, of the fishermen. The relief plane then returned to Albemarle with Bob Webber. At the suggestion of local people, the PBY took off and flew to a better anchorage for the night in nearby Red Bay. The next morning, after an uneventful night, 52 P-11 finally took off for Argentia, with a fuel stop en route at the Royal Canadian Air Force Base at Botwood. The other 7 PBY aircraft flying the search mission, 52 P-1, -2, -3, -4, -7, -8, and -12, were launched near sunset at 17:20 hours on the 24th, proceeding independently to reach the search area south of Cape Farewell at sunrise. Weather en route was like that experienced by the first group, poor with ceiling and visibility near zero below clouds, with icing and heavy turbulence in clouds. With unknown winds and no opportunity for star sights, aircraft positions were uncertain, at best, but the flight continued toward the search area until it was ordered by the flight leader to return to base, weather conditions obviously making visual search impossible. Most of the return flight was on instruments, in icing and increasingly severe turbulence. On approaching Argentia, the aircraft were advised by radio, as the first search group had been, that conditions were below minimums and not expected to improve. Planes with sufficient fuel were directed to continue to Halifax, where weather was forecast to be suitable for landing. Those with low fuel states were advised to hold and to attempt instrument approaches when weather improved. Numbers 1, 7, and 8 found holes in the overcast and landed in Shoal Harbour on Random Island, Newfoundland. Numbers 3 and 4 were able to let down and landed in Fortune Bay, west of Placentia Bay. Number 2, nearly out of fuel, landed off St. Mary's Island, Quebec. Last of the group, number 12, reported on the water safely, out of fuel, on the north side of Anticosti Island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. As weather improved on the 25th, 6 of the PBY aircraft were able to fly back to Argentia during the afternoon, all of them logging 20 to 22 hours in the air for the mission. On the 26th, the squadron flew fuel to numbers 2 and 12, and both were back in Argentia later that day. Number 12 had provoked a minor international incident at Anticosti Island when some of the crew went ashore in a raft to check on their location and were unable to communicate with the French-speaking natives. The natives assumed the flyers were German and the advance guard of a Nazi invasion force. Their report to Canadian authorities generated a precautionary air defense alert, as the Canadians had not been advised, as they normally were, that the search mission had been launched on the 24th. Although this extension of the Neutrality Patrol mission had been unsuccessful, it had demonstrated that pilots and flight crewmen were resourceful and that the rugged PBY then, as it did repeatedly during World War II, could be depended upon to bring her crews home. The exercise had also demonstrated that communications equipment and its operators needed improvement, and that accurate weather forecasts were essential if North Atlantic seaplane operations were to be successful. On July 1, 1941, as part of a general reorganization of fleet patrol squadrons, Patrol Wing, Pat Wing, Support Force was redesignated Patrol Wing 7, continuing as a support force unit. Wing PBY squadrons 51, 52, 53 and 55 were redesignated 71, 72, 73 and 74. The last, after receiving 3 PBM-1 aircraft from VP-56, was equipped with 12 PBM-1 aircraft. VP-56 and its remaining PBM aircraft became a transitional training unit under Commander Patrol Wing's Atlantic Fleet. A new Patrol Wing, 8, was established, with several old redesignated squadrons and some newly established ones assigned. Although a part of Support Force, Pat Wing 8 provided little more than training service for the remainder of 1941 and was transferred to the West Coast after war's start. Summer 1941 proved an active time for squadrons, both in Newfoundland and at home in the States. Patrols and convoy escort were major tasks, but there were also surveys of Iceland, Greenland, and Labrador, and search and rescue missions. On the heels of the Bismarck search, on May 29th, VP-52 deployed 4 PBY aircraft to Iceland. Based on Belknap AVD-8 at Reykjavik, the planes surveyed Greenland's east coast, where Danish weather stations were suspected of being in German hands. Flights on May 31st and June 5th located the stations, with no indication that they were in use, and, on June 8th, the detachment returned to Argentia. Later in the month, the squadron ferried old planes to Norfolk, Virginia, turning them over to newly commissioned VP-43. New PBY-5 aircraft in blue-grey over light-grey camouflage, with self-sealing fuel cells, armor and revised waist gun stations, were picked up and flown back to Quonset Point and Argentia. Increased weight and the rough, non-specular camouflage reduced speed, decreased rate of climb, and extended takeoff time and distance significantly in comparison to earlier PBY-5 aircraft. Squadron markings were in black, and the Neutrality Patrol star on the bow, authorized on March 19, 1940, was continued in use. The star was also authorized for Ranger CV-4 and Wasp CV-7 Air Group aircraft, and was moved to the aft fuselage when a December 1940 directive changed ship-based aircraft color to overall light grey. On July 3rd, 4 of the new planes, with auxiliary hull tanks to compensate for fuel capacity lost to self-sealing tanks, departed Argentia for Reykjavik. One of the group, 72P-12, failed to arrive in Iceland and was presumed lost to weather or to an explosion while transferring fuel from hull tanks. Extensive search of the route and Greenland coast failed to find any trace of the plane, VP-70, 2's first ever loss of a crew. This VP-72 detachment provided escort cover for a task force which landed a U.S. Marine Corps force in Iceland on July 7th. On the 13th, the task force departed to return to the States and was escorted out of the harbour and for the remainder of the day by the PBY aircraft. During summer, the Argentia detachments of VPs 71, 72, and 73 began a rotation program, later including VP 74, which regularly exchanged deployed planes and personnel at the advance base with those at home ports, Quonset Point and Norfolk. Crew training and major maintenance were conducted in the States, while operational flights received priority at Argentia. On July 19th, VP 74 deployed a three-plane PBM-1 detachment to Argentia. The addition of PBM aircraft, with new demands for structural and engine maintenance, stretched Albemarle's resources and support capability to their limits. By early August, a detachment of VP 74 PBM aircraft and VP 73 PBY aircraft, based on Goldsboro AVD-5, were providing routine convoy escort in North Atlantic shipping lanes from Skerja Fjord, near Reykjavik. Convoys were covered up to 500 miles from base, and a regular anti-submarine warfare patrol of Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland was flown. From August 6th through 20th, VP 71 conducted a three-plane survey of Greenland, based on Lapwing AVD-1, in Tungliafik Fjord on Iceland's west coast. This was a joint US Army-Navy project. During this period, both PBY and PBM aircraft began receiving early-model British radar, the ASV, with antenna arrays on hull-mounted posts. The transmitting antenna posts on the sides of the forward hull were vulnerable to damage by boats tending planes at the buoys, and there was little success in keeping the gear operational. In August, Roosevelt and Churchill held the historic six-day conference in Argentia aboard Augusta CA-31, which produced the Atlantic Charter, released to the public on August 14th. During preparations and for the duration of the conference, Patwing 7 squadrons flew a heavy schedule of offshore and harbour patrol, guarding the site. Seaplane operations from Iceland, severely hampered by a lack of any facilities ashore, were by far the most difficult yet experienced by neutrality patrol forces. Crew messing and berthing aboard the converted World War I destroyer seaplane tenders were so limited that most crews preferred to stay aboard the planes at the buoys. That was so until Iceland weather began to display its true character later in the year, with winds of 50 to 60 knots and high sea states the norm. Temperatures were rarely far above freezing, and living aboard the uninsulated, unheated PBY aircraft became an ordeal. The PBM aircraft were better, but still far from comfortable. Servicing aircraft at the buoys was a brutal test of skills, perseverance, and dedication. As the countdown toward World War II continued during 1940, one's final months, neutrality patrol operations moved ever farther from neutrality toward active Allied support. Convoy escort and ASW patrol planes began carrying general-purpose and depth bombs during summer months, orders for attacks on hostile forces threatening US and non-Axis foreign flag shipping were in force and were amplified and extended by Argentia Air Detachment OP orders in September and October, based on Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Fleet, Sinclair-Felt, orders. These directives were explicit regarding shipping protection, escorting convoys, and destroying German and Italian naval, land, and air forces encountered. VP 70 One established an advance base operation on Gannet AVP-8 at Kungnate Bay, Greenland, on October 1st, but was forced to recall it on the 18th due to the violence and uncertainties of Greenland weather. Weather at Argentia was little better, but operations continued, with convoy escort in shipping lanes the major effort. The full impact of orders regarding shipping protection was dramatically emphasized by a series of events in the North Atlantic in September and October. On September 4, 1941, Greer DD-145, a destroyer en route to Iceland, was notified by a British patrol plane that a German U-boat was in her area. When asked if she would attack the submarine, Greer answered in the negative, having no orders at that time to initiate such action. The British plane then attacked the U-boat with depth bombs, with no apparent result, and left the area. The submarine, not knowing the attack source, maneuvered into position and fired 2 torpedoes at Greer, both missing the target. The ship, acting in self-defense, delivered a depth charge attack on the submarine, again with no effect, and resumed course for Iceland. This event resulted in the neutrality patrol mission becoming search and destroy, as in the Sinclair-Felt orders referred to above. Another, even closer indication of shooting war proximity occurred on October 17th, when destroyer Carney DD-432 was torpedoed with the loss of 11 lives while defending a British convoy off Iceland. The ship limped into port, severely damaged. Later in October, tanker Salinas AO-19 was torpedoed, with no loss of life but with a huge hole blasted through both sides of the ship. Ensign Bill Hardacre and his crew in 72 P11 found her on October 30th and escorted her towards St. John's, Newfoundland. On October 31st, while providing convoy escort off Halifax, the old four-stack destroyer Reuben James DD-245 was torpedoed and sank with the loss of 115 lives. These losses brought congressional action to relax Neutrality Act restrictions by allowing U.S. ships to escort convoys into combat zones and U.S. merchant ships to be armed. Just 5 weeks after these final events in Neutrality Patrol history, the attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. The Neutrality Patrol had served a purpose, though not the one intended by September 1939 directives, which established the patrol as insurance against U.S. involvement in European war. What had been accomplished had an immediate and profound effect on the war and, ultimately, on our war readiness. As it began, the patrol safeguarded our neutrality and the sanctuary our home waters provided for ourselves and for our future allies. Later, it assured delivery of war material which kept our allies fighting despite overwhelming odds, and it created requirements for more and better equipment and personnel to man it. Naval aviation, especially the patrol wings and squadrons, would have been ill-prepared for war had it not been for demands placed on it by the Neutrality Patrol and the resulting stimulation and training, which produced the high level of operational readiness achieved by the time war came.